Well, God loves you and I love you and you're stuck with that. We're going to start a new series on the book of Daniel. And it shouldn't take too many weeks. There's 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. Probably 10 lessons, I think. We'll see. I'm going to include an introduction along with chapter 1 in this video. Should be able to do it in less than half an hour. Some of the lessons will be less than half an hour. That's okay. Better to be short than boring, I hope. Hope I'm not boring. All right, so Daniel was taken. I'm going to give you some history here too. Daniel was taken by captive by King Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. Now, he wasn't king yet. While he was attacking, he was commanding general for his father, and while he was attacking Jerusalem on his way back from conquering Egypt, or at least defeating them, he stopped off in Jerusalem. Got to do something on your way home. And he sacked Jerusalem. No, not totally destroying it. That comes in a few years. But he took some captives, and Daniel was one of them. Now, tradition says Daniel was born in 620 BC. We do not know that in the Bible. Jewish tradition says that, so they're pretty good at that kind of stuff. I'll go with it. That means he was 15 years old when he was taken prisoner to Babylon. And he was one of a small group that would be trained in the king's court in Babylon. And some of this is in chapter 1, but I'm going to cover it now. There are 4 young men, Daniel and 3 others, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are Babylonian names, not Hebrew. I'll come back to that. They were young men from the Jewish royal family. Now, there were probably other nobility that were taken captive, but these 4 in specific were from the tribe of Judah, the royal family. And these young men were chosen for their intelligence and good looks, and Daniel's writing tells us that he was very knowledgeable about Babylonian and Persian culture. That probably came about over the years of captivity. And if you didn't know it, by the way, the name Daniel stands for or means God is judge. Love it. And in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, Jesus mentions Daniel as the author of this book. So, I got some more here in the intro that I'm going to skip over for now. One interesting quirk, I mentioned the names. The Hebrew names of these 4 specific young men that are going to be in this book, mostly Daniel is in the book, and then his 3 companions are in 2 chapters. Their Hebrew names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their Babylonian names were Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Why is it that we use Daniel's Hebrew name and Babylonian names for the others? I have no clue. Just kind of funny, isn't it? So, setting some, references or other things happening. You can read about Daniel's story, the captivity of Jerusalem's conquest, so forth, in 1 Chronicles 6, 2 Chronicles 36, and 2 Kings 23 to 25. But contemporaries of Daniel include the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as Queen Esther. Those 3 books, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, they all reference Nebuchadnezzar having taken items from God's temple in Jerusalem as looking back at history from their perspective. Jeremiah, on the other hand, predates Daniel by a little bit and overlaps Daniel by quite a bit. So Jeremiah 21 through 52 talk about Nebuchadnezzar conquering Jerusalem. He prophesies about 70 years of captivity. Guess how long Daniel was there before they started sending people back to Judah, Jerusalem? 70 years. And Jeremiah also said everything that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple would be returned and he would be defeated. It was all returned with Ezra and Nehemiah, and he was defeated. Nebuchadnezzar was, the Babylonians were defeated in chapter 5 of Daniel. Jeremiah wrote a letter to the Israelites in Babylon, the captives, and mention was made of Jeremiah being there during King Nebuchadnezzar's 18th reign as king, when Jeremiah became one of his prisoners. Now, God also allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Egypt and Kedar and Hazor, and God said he would rescue Judah from Babylon. Ezekiel 26 through 30 says God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Jerusalem and Egypt. So a lot of scriptural references to this time frame. And along with Daniel's contemporary prophets' writings, Habakkuk and Zephaniah both ministered just prior to the Babylonian exile. Jeremiah and Ezekiel during. Jeremiah's ministry was primarily in Jerusalem, and it began before King Nebuchadnezzar. I think I skipped over that. His father passed away, and Nebuchadnezzar had to rush back to Babylon because he had a couple of brothers, one of whom had a pretty good claim for the throne. So he had to rush back to make sure he got the throne. Jeremiah was taken captive to Babylon. Eventually, he did get to leave. He joined some Israelites that went to Egypt. Ezekiel was taken to Babylon as a captive a few years after Daniel was taken. So some dates. Quite a few dates. The big one here is the events of Daniel's book occurred from 605 BC to 536 BC. If you're counting, that's 69 years. And this period includes the end of the kingdom of Judah, and it ends, that frame of Daniel ends before Ezra and Nehemiah led the restoration of Jerusalem. And the end of Daniel's story coincides with Babylon being conquered by the Persians, including King Cyrus the Great, aka Cyrus II. Also known as Darius. That's not my notes. I've always thought they were two different men. As I studied it more, I think they're the same man. Perhaps, like Daniel, he had two names from two different cultures. Anyway, an overview of the book, and then I'm going to come back to some dates. His primary message is just that God is the ultimate controlling authority, with his purpose being to encourage, purpose of Daniel's book being to encourage people to have hope if they're God's people. And the book teaches that it's possible for God's people to keep God's commands even when they are surrounded by people who have no regard for God, even when things are not happening the way they want them to happen. Interesting little trivia twist. The book of Daniel is not included with the other prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. In our Protestant Bible and Catholic Bibles, it's included with the four other major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah with his Lamentations, and Ezekiel. So 4 major prophets, one wrote 2 books. Daniel's included there, but in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's included in a group that they call the writings. Significance? Well, and the Hebrew Scriptures, when they say prophets, it means major, minor to us. The Jews considered Daniel's book more inspirational than prophetic. A little puzzling, I think, especially because a lot of modern end times specialists quote Daniel, 70 weeks, But the first few chapters, very, very much, first 5 chapters, very, very much stories, inspirational stories. So I get it. First half is more inspirational, the last half more prophetic. That's the way I see it. Not important, just fun. The book is, and actually it's 6 chapters that are stories, and 6 chapters that are more prophetic. Then that's how the book is divided. Chapters 1 through 6 are 6 very good stories. Daniel and his friends become captives, and they have the Daniel fast, it's called. Daniel interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream that he won't tell anyone what it was. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into a fiery furnace. Then Daniel interprets another dream for Nebuchadnezzar, not one he wanted to tell the king about. And then the handwriting on the wall. And the final of those 6 chapters is Daniel in the lion's den. The last 6 chapters, there are basically 4 prophetic visions. And I say 4. Chapters 10 through 12, you can consider it one vision, but it's really multiple, I think. Let's see when we get there. There are some apocryphal additions. By apocrypha, I mean books that are included in the Bible in some denominations, Catholics, Orthodox churches, whatever. And I do study and teach out of the apocrypha occasionally. I'm going to give you a brief overview. There are 3 specific additions to Daniel. I'm not going to teach them. I'm just going to tell you about them. And if you want, I have them in my notes, and I have them separate. I can give them to you either way you want. I think I've done a video on the Apocrypha. If I haven't, I'll do one soon. But the first one is called The Story of Susanna, and it precedes Daniel chapter 1. This is still in Judah, still in Jerusalem. The second one is Prayer of Azariah, which you know as Abednego, and it's also called The Song of the 3 Jews. And it is inserted in between Daniel 3:23 and Daniel 3:24. Fits in there too. Nice story. And then the last one is Bel and the Dragon. And it's kind of about 2 Babylonian gods. Bel and the dragon. So, and what happens when Daniel gets involved with opposing them. And that happens after the book of Daniel. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm not going to include them in this series of lessons, but I am going to tell you about them. So, like the story of Susanna, like the biblical book of Daniel, her story occurs, maybe after being taken into exile. I'm not very confident of that. But a man named Joachim is a wealthy and well-respected Jew. And there are 2 elders who were also judges. And they lusted for Joachim's very beautiful and devout wife named Susanna. They told her to yield herself to them in a sexual manner, or they would charge her with adultery with a young man who would conveniently escape. Susanna refuses and remains faithful to God and her husband, and they have her sentenced to death. And as she is being taken away, she calls out to God, and God has Daniel intervene. He was very young, teenager for sure at this time. And he questions the 2 elders separately. And the other elders gave him a lot of respect. And he questioned them separately, and their answers proved to be lies. And so they were executed. It's thought that this story would probably have been written in Greek based on linguistical evidence. And again, whenever I say that usually means somebody smarter than me is looking at the languages. And They believe it was written during or after Greece's conquest and rule of Palestine, or just before the Maccabees rebellion, so like 100, 200 years before Christ. And they say it was probably written in Palestine, so that's why it's not included in our Bible. It's still a very interesting story. Fun read. The Prayer of Azariah, or the Song of the Three Jews, is the three Jews. It's the story, they're in the furnace. What happens in the furnace? Have you ever wondered that? Oh, I'll talk about it more when we get to chapter 3. But this passage is thought to have been written, or is that chapter 2? No, that's chapter 3. Anyway, it's thought to have been written in either Hebrew or more likely Aramaic, based on the linguistical evidence. The date is even more difficult to identify, but it's commonly thought to be about 200 years before Christ. And based on that, it's probably written from when they were in Palestine. The third of the apocryphal additions to Daniel. And you can see why they aren't included in our Bible. Probably not original to the book of Daniel, but they fit real nice. Bel and the Dragon. One of the Babylonian gods was named Marduk. He's also called Bel, B-E-L. And he was actually probably their number one god, although they had a few. But they had a temple to Bel that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And Daniel was companion of the king, claimed that Bel was not a living god. Not going too deep, but the king didn't like that. He was angry. He demanded proof. And based on the proof, either the priests of Bel or Daniel would be put to death. How would you like to take that challenge? Well, 70 of Bel's priests had the king place Bel's daily food allotment into his temple and seal it with the king's own signet ring. After the priests left, the king watched Daniel spread some ashes on the floor. When they came back in the morning, the footprints showed the priests and their wives and children had all entered through a secret door from underneath the altar, and they ate the food. Since Daniel had been right, and the priests and their families, so they were put to death. Daniel was then allowed to destroy the temple of Bel. Now, another of their gods was an enormous snake, dragon. And Daniel demonstrated this was no god by killing it. You'll have to read the story. But there's actually a third story with Bel and the dragon. And that's about Daniel in a lion's den. I'm not certain if this is a retelling of the already recorded story or a second incident. It's got an addition if it's part of the story we know. And it's thought it was written under a period of serious persecution of the Jews, probably close to the time of Christ, maybe 125 to 150 BC. That fits with the linguistic evidence, and it was almost certainly written in Hebrew or more likely Aramaic by an unknown author that was living in Palestine at that time. Okay. Key dates and events. This is just to keep you in the scheme of things. Remember, I always try and get you to understand the history, the culture, the events. So just going back a ways, remember Daniel's book starts at 605 BC. 240 years before that, in 845 BC, Assyria became the leading power in the Middle East under King Tiglath-Pileser. Whatever. And that's when Assyria kind of took over. When Abraham was alive, it was Ur of the Chaldeans. It was more loosey-goosey than kingdom up until Assyria. So in 625 BC, prior to 625 BC, I think 636, if my memory's right, King Nabopolassar, of Babylon rebelled against Assyria. And in 625 BC, he successfully conquered Assyria. And his son, as King Nebuchadnezzar II, or King Nebuchadnezzar the Great, was the commanding general of his army. In 612 BC, Babylon conquered Nineveh. So 13 years after the rebellion began, they finally were free. So in 605 BC, Babylon defeated Egypt, driving them out of the Middle East. And Nebuchadnezzar was attacking Jerusalem. He rushes home, and he takes a bunch of captives with him. 8 years later, in 597 BC, Jerusalem's conquered again, and this time the temple was destroyed. A second group of captives was taken to Babylon, including Ezekiel. And then in 536, 69 years after Daniel was taken, Babylon is conquered by Persian King Cyrus. And then over the next 90 years, the Persian kings, not just Cyrus, allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to lead some Israelites back to Jerusalem. All right, I am not going to get Daniel 1 in the introduction. Sorry, 2 lessons. So in just listing the kings of Babylon, 625, King Nabopolassar, and 20 years later, 605, his son Nebuchadnezzar II becomes king, and he was named for Nebuchadnezzar I, we believe, who lived from 1125 to 1104 BC, so 500 years before. Just for fun, I want to show you, that is King Nebuchadnezzar's name in Babylonian. Yeah, I can't read it either. But I thought it was cute, so I added it to my notes. 562 BC. That's 40 years after Nebuchadnezzar became king. Marduk. Marduk, remember, was one of their gods. Marduk, the son of Nebuchadnezzar II, the great Nebuchadnezzar, was murdered almost immediately by Neriglissar. So he was only king for less than a year. 2 years. Anyway, he didn't do very well. Neriglissar was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar II. He was husband of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter Keziah, and Jeremiah 39 tells us he was one of Nebuchadnezzar's senior military officials, general, if you will. But he killed Nebuchadnezzar's son to become king. Not very common in those days. But he must have had the support of the army. So 4 years later, we have a new king. His son of Neriglissar, Labashai Marduk, same god as Nebuchadnezzar's son Marduk was named for, Marduk. And now it's Neriglissar named his son Labashai-Marduk, hyphenated. He had a very, very short reign. He was the one less than a year. Marduk was 2. So in 556, Nabonidus, anyway, he was the last true king of Babylon before Persia conquered. We'll see his story in chapter 5. His son Belshazzar, and again, we'll get to this later, but I'm going to tell you now and you can remember later. Belshazzar was the acting king because his father Nabonidus was focused on other things than running the kingdom. And it's thought that Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar II through his daughter Nitocris. And I'll mention that again in chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we will see that Nabonidus, the handwriting on the wall, it was the end of his kingdom. And that's the year Persia conquers Babylon. All right, so here is where we're going to stop. If you would like, and you want to go look for it, it's on the internet. The story of Susanna is an interesting read before our next lesson. God bless you. Have a most wonderful day. Bye now.